Well, hello and welcome to KCMI Hope Radio 97.1. You're listening to Ask the Pastor, and we're sitting here with some worship leaders and pastors from some various churches from around town, and we're talking about worship. Last week we talked about Unite Night of Worship, and that's kind of why our senior pastors asked us to do this. But I am Pastor Ken Boehr from Mitchell Berean Church.
I'm Cody Peterson from Westway Christian Church.
Antonio Cortez from the Rock Church.
And this session, we're talking a little bit about the scripture that talks about worship and our theology behind worship and how we design our philosophy of what we're doing in worship. And so we've been talking about that a little bit and priming the pump, and just a lot of good thoughts here about what worship is. And does one of you want to kick it off? I mean, I don't want to hog all the time here.
Sure. I think, like, when I think about worship and like growing up in the church, I guess one of the big misconceptions that I've heard and seen is that worship is singing. And now, like, being way far removed from that years later, like, it's easy to look back and just say, like, worship is so much more than just what we do on Sunday morning. Worship is so much more than just the songs we sing, which is what I think the most common association with worship is. Like, we're doing Unite Night of Worship here in a couple days, and we say Night of Worship, and the majority of it is singing songs. Mm-hmm. So, like, just that instant correlation. But one of the things that I've tried to do in my ministry is really paint that broad picture of worship is so much more than just the songs we sing. Worship is so much more than just what we do on a Sunday morning in our services. But really, it's like you were saying before we went on air, it's a lifestyle.
Yeah, no, worship is a lifestyle. I brought up 1 Corinthians 10:31. So whatever you eat or drink, whatever you do, do it all for the glory of God. And I think worship is really from our hearts, and it really starts personally too, with what we're doing to prepare for the weekends. But really, what are we doing in our own spiritual lives? What are we doing on that one-on-one time with God? It all starts there. So,
right. I really believe that everything we do is in a direction of worshiping something, whether that's self and an identity or a personal benefit, or promotion to ourselves or something else other than God. Whenever we worship something else other than the one true God, it's called idolatry. And on the other hand, we could be moving in a direction of honoring God. And it may be too simple of a definition, but I've really just kind of boiled everything down to either we're worshiping God, and that means we're living in his character, and even things that we might think are neutral, like going fishing. Like, that may be a Sabbath for somebody. That's an intentional decision on how we're spending our time, and I think that can be worship. Because we're using that to honor God, and we're admiring his creation, and we could also not be worshiping in that moment, be very selfish in that moment. So I don't think even those neutral things are neutral. They're moving us in a direction. And so if we're moving in a direction of worshiping God, that's holy and that's righteous. We're exhibiting the character of God in what we're doing. And anything that doesn't represent the character of God, I believe, is sin. And that's worshiping anything other than the one true God, and giving him glory and how we're handling ourselves and what we're pursuing. So that might be too broad of a definition, but it's just been something that I've been centering in on lately. Everything we're doing is pointing us in a direction, and that can be away from God or toward God. Away from God, that's going to be sin. If it's not exhibiting his character or drawing us into relationship with him, it's sin. If it's drawing us closer to him or representing his character well, then it's holy and righteous and it's good. It's worship.
Yeah, and that's kind of countercultural to the culture that we're in right now. When I listen to you talk about that, the thing that I'm hearing is like taking the focus off of ourselves and our selfish ambitions and all of those things, and putting the focus where it truly needs to be, on God. And so everything that we're doing, like the verse that you just mentioned, Antonio, like everything we do for the glory of God, like that's moving us towards God in worship. Yeah. And anything that's not is moving us in the opposite direction. And it made me think of a quote that I've heard by Eugene Peterson, and he said, "Worship is the strategy by which we interrupt our preoccupation with ourselves and attend to the presence of God." And I think as we look at our culture, like, it's so me driven, and like what's best for me, and this is how I identify, and this is my truth, and all of these things. Like, those are so focused on me and not on God. And I think that's where we get into trouble too. And like, we've been talking about Unite Night of Worship, and our theme verse really fits in with that too.
Let me read it.
Yeah, go ahead.
And so, dear brothers and sisters, I plead with you to give your bodies to God because of all he has done for you. Let them be a living and holy sacrifice, the kind he will find acceptable. This is truly the way to worship him. Don't copy the behavior and customs of this world, but let God transform you into a new person by changing the way you think. Then you will learn to know God's will for you, which is good and pleasing and perfect.
Yeah, and so just that concept of, like, don't be conformed by the patterns of this world, but be transformed. Be transformed by God, and letting him renew you, your mind, and then everything you do being pointed in through his character and his direction in your lives. Like, that's what true worship is.
Yeah, you hit on something, and I want to expand on that. And it was a personal story. Really setting my heart to that is, I had to, when I first started worship leading, remember that this wasn't for me, and I wasn't doing this for me, and I wasn't doing this for the church, but I had to sit back and remember, who are we really doing this for? And I think that's something that I try to really, in the ministry field, I stress out to everybody, is that, when we're worshiping, let's not focus too much on how we look, or the way we do this, or the skill level we do that. We want to use the skills and talents that God's provided for us, but let's remember who we're doing it for, and who we're glorifying, and who we're truly singing to.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And while we're doing it for God, just to piggyback off of that, does he need it? Is his personal affirmation based on whether we do something for him or not? And God's independent, and he doesn't need our worship. And so what we do for him is just blessing his heart. And it's a relationship with God. It's not because, we have to. We're commanded to. I don't mean that at all. Like you can do it. You can worship something else. Like, that's okay. But God doesn't need our worship, but he wants it, and I think that's what makes it love. Our obedience to him, as stated in Romans 12:1 and 2. That obedience, which is worship, is an act of love. So we're choosing to do the right thing, and that's worship, and it blesses his heart.
And I think, like, while God doesn't need our worship, but he wants our worship, I think, like, deep within all of us, we have that need to worship. And, like, I think of, in my life, like, we all have one major thing that we could all be super thankful for, and that was the fact that, like, God delivered us through Jesus and what he did for us on the cross. And, like, we have so many reasons to worship him, and really, when you boil it down, like, that's what worship is. It's our response to God because of what he's done in the past, what he's currently doing in our lives, and the promise of what he has for us in the future. And I think just sitting in that and recognizing that, like, God is worthy, and, like, because of all the things that he's done in our lives, like, we should want to live our lives, like, all of our lives, everything we do, in worship to him.
Yeah. Can I add on to that? I heard, what he's done, doing, is going to do. All of us kind of do, but there's an aspect of worship as well that's just who he is. Yeah. I am who I am. Like, who is God? I am. Like, wow. I mean, so it just sounds so basic, but he's the source of all things. Like, just worshiping him for who he is, aside from even what he's done for me. Like, wow, God, you've created. Well, that's a do thing too, but man, you are just, you are love, full of love, you and all of that gets exhibited out, so it can probably be a do thing. But just his character and his power, and who he is enough for us just to worship him.
I think you hit it. You said he doesn't need our worship, but he wants our worship. And I think personally, when I just think about all that he's done for me and all that he is doing for me. And yeah, like my act of worship, and I feel like we all believe and we have our hearts set on the same, but like, why not worship him? You know what I mean? Like, that's ultimately comes down to, is like, he wants our worship, and for all that he's been doing and all that he's done in our lives and all that he's continuing to do. I mean, Father, I'll worship you for all my days. I mean, it's just so amazing to see what he's done, and whatever I can and give and bless him with is what I want to do. So
I want to throw a curveball here. And like, we're talking about this concept of worship, and like, I guess my question for you guys is, like, is there one specific moment that you can look back and think on in your life or ministry where like you had this like experience with God where you could look back on it and say, like, I was in the presence of God, and like in the most purest form of worship that you can have? And I guess I'll start this and give you some time to think about this. But like, I think of all the different ways that we worship. And Ken, you mentioned fishing, and
I don't fish. I'm not a fisher, guys. Don't look at me and be like, dude, I'll go fishing with Ken. I really don't enjoy that.
I'm not really.
I don't see how that could be an act of worship, guys.
I'm not a fisherman either, but I think back to, I came from a youth ministry background, and one of the camps that we went to every year, we would, the camp itself sat in the Rocky Mountains of Colorado, right at 10,000 feet, and then we would hike up to a 12,000 foot peak every week that we were there with the kids. And I remember I went back after the fact just on a weekend retreat, and myself and my wife and my dad made that hike up that 2,000 foot elevation change to the peak. And I remember just kind of sitting out, looking over the park, and like just really taking in everything that God had created. And I could see down, and like the major highway that runs through close to the camp, where like it's busy traffic, you're so far removed from that it looks like ants, and just looking back over the vast expanse of everything right there in this tiny little piece of Colorado, in this, like, it's a tiny piece of this huge creation that God has created, and just like sitting there in awe, saying, like, just thinking to myself, like, God, if you were able to create all of this with all of the intricate detail and everything that I'm experiencing right now, like, there's all that I could do was sit back and thank him for that, and for letting me experience that. And so that was one of the main things for me. So I'd be curious if you guys have similar experiences that you want to share, or...
Sure, I can go. Yeah. Man, I agree with you. The mountains and getting in creation is just phenomenal. And usually, honestly, when I'm alone, but I tell you, some of the most intimate times I have is just sitting down, turning the lights off, whether it's in my office or if I'm at home alone. And even though I'm primarily a guitar player, just sitting down and playing the piano, and just offering that up as a gift to God, mistakes and all, and just reflecting. And I think that's the source of worship, is reflecting on, what he's done for us and who he is. And so just sitting there in awe of just how he could love me, and just playing piano, and tears come and joy comes, and the music follows that, and the emotion behind that, and it's the truth that's driving the emotion and not the other way around, and so those are probably the deepest times of worship for me, when I'm just sitting down and reflecting. I
would say I'm kind of in the same mindset as you. I used to struggle with being in the still. I used to now just being able to, like you said, just set all distractions aside, and whether that's playing, praying, listening to music, and just worshiping there. I don't know. I just really, that's when I have my most spiritual time, and that just, really just sitting down and setting on distractions aside and saying, okay, God, would you speak to me now? Would you, and then just worshiping and having your own little worship session by yourself. Those are so deep and intentional than any other worship session will be. And so it just amazes me.
We love worshiping with you, churches, but it's just us and God, man. That's where it's at. And you and God, just, find a way that you can worship God.
Yeah. It's awesome.
Well, thanks for listening to KCMI. Hope Radio 97.1. You're listening to Ask the Pastor, and join us next time to hear a little bit more about philosophy of worship, maybe our stories of how we got into worship leading, and much more. See you next time.